Hey guys, so I wanted to talk about how to approach contemporary music as someone who's inexperienced in playing contemporary music. It's something that I get asked a lot. This particular subject was brought up by Annie Mason, who's an incredible contemporary bassoonist currently at University of Illinois. And I think it's very worthwhile to kind of give some ideas on how to approach this music because it isn't necessarily talked about in school, which is really unfortunate, let me tell you. The first thing is you have to be able to take the time to learn the language before you can even touch the music. And we've all spent the time to learn how to read note heads and learn how to read sheet music. But contemporary music uses an expanded vocabulary that not everyone has had the time to learn yet. And while you can learn it in the midst of learning the piece, it's way easier if you spend the time to look at whatever score you're working on, figure out if you know how to read it all, and if you don't, learn to read it before you even touch your instrument. A lot of the time, and most of the time, they should provide a notation guide in the score. If they don't, then ask as many people as you possibly can for advice. And if you have access to the composer themselves, one, tell them to provide a notation guide, and two, ask them. It's way more difficult, and it's going to be way more frustrating if you're learning the notes, the sounds, and how to read it all at the same time. Along those lines, you also do have to learn how to do all the techniques. And I don't necessarily recommend learning them in the context of the piece the first time you're ever doing them. I actually learned how to do a lot of the flute contemporary techniques away from the instrument, let alone away from music. I learned how to do all of the mouth shapes and the tongue action without the flute anywhere near me. Then learned how to apply it to the flute, and then learned how to do it in context. And we don't always have the luxury of that much time, but it's still worth taking a day or two and just figuring out how to make all of the sounds that are required in the piece before you start working them into the context of the piece. And that's something that your teacher might not necessarily be able to help you with because you don't always study with people who play contemporary music. If you do, great, and use them as a resource. If you have colleagues or peers or classmates who play contemporary music, use them as a resource. And if not, take to the internet, but be very careful with that. Definitely make sure that the person you're listening to is a reputable source who has training in contemporary music and experience playing contemporary music, because sometimes you can learn how to do things wrong and it's going to make your life harder, and it's also potentially going to hurt you. That being said, the internet is great and please do use it. Once you have the building blocks all set, then you can start working them into the piece itself. And I always like to talk about this the same way you learn your scales before you learn the piece. And so when you see a scale in the piece, you know, okay, I've played a C major scale before. This is how I play a C major scale. There's a C major scale, then I just do it. With contemporary sounds, that's exactly what you do. I know how to do a slap tongue. There's a slap tongue. This is how I do it. And you might need a little bit of practice and getting in and out of it, but you at least can identify what it is, how to do it, and then put it in the context. And the work that you have to do is just putting it in the context rather than figuring out how to identify it, figuring out how to make the sound, and then putting it into the context. You've already done that work. And definitely mark up your scores as much as you need to. I sometimes see this idea, especially with younger college-age students, that marking your scores is for little kids. Even writing note names, because I do it all the time, especially for the crazy ledger lines. Yeah, I'm going to write the note name in because I don't want to have to think about it. But make your life easy. Mark the things that you are struggling with or need a little bit of help to figure out. I love bracketing weird intervals and bracketing patterns into things so that I have an easy way to lock into whatever pattern it is. And that's one of the daunting things with contemporary music, is that it doesn't necessarily follow the diatonic scale patterns that we all are used to. Sometimes it's modes of limited transposition like octatonic and whole tone scales. Sometimes it's completely atonal and there's no pattern to be found, but you can still break down little patterns within it. I mark thirds or minor seconds and things where I can lock into something that I can identify as an easy interval. And marking your score, there's no shame in marking your scores, and in fact, you should do it. And even within that, sometimes the music is so technically difficult that it seems impossible. And when that's the case, the composer usually isn't going for perfection. You are welcome to ask them if you have access to them, but listen to recordings if they exist and see how accurate they are, because chances are, if it's so hard that it almost seems impossible, they're going for the gesture and not for accuracy. Obviously, the goal is to get as many of the right notes and in the right places in the right rhythm as possible, but if that is going to hinder the musical character and the musical idea, 99% of composers are going to tell you to play a few wrong notes or drop a couple notes or whatever it is that will make it easier. And we come from this mindset of perfection where you have to play all of the right notes, and that's partially because diatonic music is easier to identify the wrong notes in, but it's also because the style of writing music has changed, and it's less about melody a lot of the time and more about gesture and texture and the way you're producing the sounds and not the sounds themselves, if that makes any sense. And that's something that definitely comes with time, and the comfort level of I'm playing wrong notes, but this is still right, comes with experience. But it's something to keep in mind that you don't have to play everything perfectly to play a piece well. The last thing I want to leave you guys with is really commit to what you're doing. A lot of the most famous contemporary music has very theatrical elements to it and has some kind of silly things in it. And while some of this music is silly and you're welcome to put the humor in it, some of it is very serious. Those of you who are flutists know Takemitsu Voice as a pretty standard contemporary flute piece that requires theatrical performance where you have to speak and you have to yell and you have to commit to what may sound silly. But what I've discovered is that if you believe that what you're doing is right and that it's 100% owned by you as a performer, it won't sound silly to the audience. A lot of you guys may have heard the recording that Emily and I have of Ken Mosberg's piece Big Ass Moth, which requires us to literally scream at the top of our lungs. And yes, in our rehearsals, we did burst out laughing, and that piece is quite comical. But the comedy comes with the commitment of the performers. If we just kind of got up there and didn't completely commit to screaming and as loud as we possibly could, it wouldn't have the full effect of the piece. And then it wouldn't be as fun to play. And it also wouldn't feel as comfortable to play. I heard a performance of Robert Dick's piece Look Out in undergrad, and the performer didn't really commit to shouting the lookout at the end. And it just seems silly and weird that the performer was supposed to shout because they weren't committed. I've since heard him play it himself, and because he's 100% committed to the gesture and to the idea of this is part of the piece and this is part of how you perform it, it's so much more effective. And it isn't an easy thing to go up and do something that you think is going to be silly, but if you can trick yourself into committing to it, even just for one performance, you'll find that it's much more effective. So there's so much to talk about with contemporary music and contemporary performance, but this is kind of the basics that I want everyone to know. And if you're thinking about starting a contemporary piece, I hope you can take some of this advice and really commit to learning it, because contemporary music isn't any different from the other music that we play. It was just written recently and hasn't had as many people play it yet.